Imagine showing up for work and never being seen again. That's what happened to 41 men inside the Harrow Sugar Refinery. The town of Harrow was not meant to be remarkable. It was a quiet settlement tucked against the slow curve of the river, a place where farmland rolled endlessly into the horizon and life moved at the pace of the seasons. But that all changed with the arrival of the refinery. When the Harrow Sugar Refinery first opened its doors, it was more than just a factory. It was a promise. To some, it was the dawn of a new era, an industrial marvel that could transform sugarcane into crystal white sweetness, faster than anyone had imagined. To others, it was a lifeline, offering steady wages in a world where work was often uncertain. The grand opening drew crowds from miles around. Families gathered in their Sunday best, children clutching their mothers' hands as steam rose in thick plumes from the towering chimneys. Local newspapers called it the pride of Harrow, a symbol that their little town had stepped boldly into the modern age. Politicians gave speeches about progress and prosperity, about the dignity of work, about how this single structure would ensure Harrow's future for generations to come. For a while it seemed true. The refinery provided not just jobs but identity. Fathers clocked in at dawn, returning home with weary smiles and the sweet tang of sugar dust still clinging to their clothes. Shops flourished, taverns stayed busy, and Sunday sermons often carried prayers of gratitude for the factory that sustained them all. Harrow's name became known beyond its borders, spoken with admiration by those who saw it as proof that industry could bring both fortune and community. The refinery itself was a sight to behold. Massive iron vats boiled and hissed, their steam mixing with the scent of burnt molasses. Machinery clattered and roared like some great beast, yet it was a beast tamed, feeding the markets of the nation and putting Harrow on the map. Inside its brick walls, men moved like shadows, shoulders bent beneath the rhythm of the machines, hands roughened by gears, fire and cane. The work was grueling, the hours long, but in those early days, pride softened the hardship. Harrow was changing. New houses sprang up, their windows glowing warmly against the night, schools filled with children whose fathers now wore the same uniform of labor. And though winters were still bitter and summers still cruel, people endured with the belief that the refinery's strength was their strength. But progress is never without a price. Even in its earliest years, the refinery whispered its warnings. There were accidents that seldom made the papers, a man crushed beneath gears, another scalded by boiling syrup. Whispers spread among the workers, quiet stories of unsafe conditions, of corners cut in the name of profit. Yet those voices rarely reached beyond the factory walls. Fear and necessity kept them silent. After all, to speak against the refinery was to risk losing everything. Still, the outward image of Harrow was one of success. On postcards, the refinery silhouette stood proudly against the river, smoke curling upward like a banner of triumph. Visitors marveled at the efficiency, the scale, the sheer ambition of it all. For them, it was progress incarnate. Iron and brick made into the promise of tomorrow. But time would reveal that beneath the polished speeches and glowing newspaper articles, a darker truth was already settling into the foundations. The refinery was not just a place of work, it was a place of secrets. The legacy of Harrow was not destined to be written in sugar but in silence. Its history would carry not only the taste of sweetness, but the bitter memory of lives swallowed whole. And though the town celebrated its refinery with pride, the day would come when that pride turned to dread, when families would gather not to cheer its smokestacks, but to search for answers hidden within its walls. Because Harrow's greatest monument to progress carried with it a shadow, one that still lingers, waiting to be told. Harrow was no longer just a town. It was a story written in sugar. With the refinery at its heart, life began to orbit around its chimneys, its whistles, and its relentless rhythm. The factory was not merely a workplace, it was the pulse of the community, beating steadily through every street and every home. Families rose with the refinery's call. At dawn, men laced up their boots and walked together toward the great brick structure, their figures stretching like shadows in the morning light. Children watched them leave, clutching school books bought with wages earned in the clatter of machines. Women kept homes filled with warmth, stitching together lives from the steady income that sugar provided. In Harrow, nearly every loaf of bread, every candle lit, every new roof raised, could be traced back to the refinery. Generations grew into its shadow. A boy might watch his father return each night with tired eyes and sugar dust in his hair, only to find himself years later standing at the same workstation, repeating the same motions, carrying the same weight. Pride was passed down like inheritance, spoken in the quiet satisfaction of having a place in the world. The refinery provides, people would say, as if those 3 words were enough to silence worry. And indeed, it seemed to provide everything. Streets widened, their cobblestones shining beneath carriage wheels. Shops lined the town square, their shelves stacked higher than before. Schools were built with polished windows, their walls echoing with the voices of children whose futures were tied, knowingly or not, to the hum of machinery. Even the town's churches grew grander, their stained glass gleaming in the morning sun, funded by donations from the pockets of refinery men. The refinery had a way of seeping into every corner of life. It built marriages, sustained families, and decided the pace of time itself. Paydays filled taverns with laughter, the air thick with the smell of ale and roasted meat. Holidays carried a sweetness, literally as sugar-laden tables overflowed with cakes, puddings, and candies. Harrow's very identity became intertwined with this abundance. People believed they were living proof of progress, that their little town had discovered the secret of survival in an unforgiving world. But sweetness has a way of masking what lies beneath. For every street paved, there was a laborer whose back had bent a little further. For every polished schoolhouse, there was a worker who had swallowed the sting of molasses-filled air. For 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. For every hymn sung in those churches, there were whispered prayers from wives who wondered if their husbands would return home in one piece. The people of Harrow rarely spoke of these things openly. To question the refinery was to question their very existence. Its generosity was a coin with 2 faces, prosperity on one side, silence on the other. And so the town carried on, raising children who would one day join the ranks, all while avoiding the truth that lingered in the shadows of the factory walls. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity, cracks began to show. Not in the bricks or the chimneys, but in the lives tethered so tightly to the refinery's demands. Debt still haunted families, accidents still stole men too soon, and disputes over wages were quietly settled before they could spread. Harrow wore its success like a proud banner, but behind the fabric were stains no one wished to see. To an outsider, Harrow was thriving. Its streets bustled, its people seemed content, and its refinery roared like a monument to progress. But those who lived there knew the truth in their bones. Dependence is a dangerous form of devotion. The same factory that built their homes could just as easily break them, and in time, it would. For prosperity always carries a hidden cost, one that Harrow was destined to pay in the most devastating way imaginable. Beneath the proud smokestacks and polished speeches lay a truth Harrow rarely put into words. The refinery may have promised progress, but for the men who toiled within its walls, progress was measured not in prosperity but in exhaustion, in sweat, in blood. The workday began before the sun. Laborers trudged through the half-light, their boots caked with mud from the riverbank, their breath hanging white in the morning air. Inside the factory was a world of heat and noise, iron grinding, steam hissing, gears rattling like bones in a jar. The air was thick with molasses and ash, sweet enough to sting the lungs, clinging to skin, settling into every fold of clothing. Hours stretched endlessly. 12, sometimes 14, passed in an unbroken rhythm of shoveling cane, feeding fires, hauling sacks heavy enough to twist a man's spine. Machines demanded constant feeding, and they were unforgiving masters. A slip of the hand, a stumble on wet stone, a moment's distraction, and the cost could be flesh, bone, or breath itself. Accidents were not uncommon. A scream swallowed by the roar of boilers, a body pulled from the gears too mangled to name. Such tragedies were spoken of in whispers, passed quietly among workers in the tavern or in hushed tones at kitchen tables. But the refinery's owners called them misfortunes, as if broken men were no more than broken tools. Families received little more than silence and, if they were lucky, a few coins pressed into their hands as consolation. And still the men returned each morning. They returned because they had to. Wages were meager, barely enough to keep food on the table and shoes on the children's feet. Some weeks the pay was docked for reasons no one dared question. A spoiled cane, damaged product, lost time, excuses stacked as high as the sacks of sugar. But hunger has no patience for pride, and so the workers endured. Resilience became their unspoken bond. Shoulder to shoulder they bore the weight together, trading small comforts in the rare moments of rest. A joke, muttered between shifts, a piece of bread passed from one calloused hand to another, a song hummed low enough to be drowned out by the machinery. Their strength was not in their pay, but in their unity, in the knowledge that they survived each day not alone, but side by side. Yet even in that unity, fear lingered. It lived in the corners of the factory, in the shadows cast by the great iron vats, in the silence that followed each scream too late to be answered. Men learned not to speak too freely, not to challenge the foreman, not to question the choices of those who sat in offices far removed from the heat of the floor. To question was to risk dismissal, and to lose the refinery meant to lose everything. In Harrow, the refinery was a blessing and a curse, a place that gave life and threatened it in the same breath. Fathers dreamed of better futures for their sons, yet many knew those sons would one day walk the same worn paths, breathe the same stifling air, bear the same scars. The cycle was inescapable, etched into the rhythm of the town. But cycles, no matter how strong, eventually break. Behind the sweat and sacrifice, behind the silence and survival, pressure was building. Workers whispered of dangers ignored, of hallways unlit, of chambers where the air itself seemed poisonous. Some spoke of missing tools and records that did not add up. Others claimed the refinery's walls hid more than sugar, that its foundations were cracked with secrets no one dared expose. The men carried on, unaware that their resilience would soon be tested beyond imagination. They did not yet know that the refinery which gave them purpose would one day become their tomb, and the unspoken fear that haunted them in whispers was about to erupt into something far more devastating, something that Harrow would never forget. It was a night like any other, or so it seemed. The refinery had roared all day, its fires glowing red against the dusk, its chimneys coughing plumes of smoke that trailed across the sky like dark ribbons. The laborers, exhausted but obedient, remained at their posts, working through the long shifts that kept Harrow alive. The townspeople heard the familiar hum, the steady beat of progress, and thought little of it. But when dawn broke, the refinery stood strangely silent. 41 men had entered the factory that night. Not one returned. At first, it was confusion. Wives waited at the doorsteps of their homes, scanning the roads for the familiar shapes of husbands trudging back from the refinery, shoulders stooped but alive. Mothers clutched children close, whispering reassurances that grew weaker as the minutes stretched into hours. Then came worry, spreading through Harrow like a fever. People gathered at the gates, calling out names, demanding answers, but the gates remained closed, and the factory loomed as if it had swallowed every sound. By mid-morning, whispers had taken root. Some said the men had been locked inside. Others believed a fire had broken out in the night, one so fierce it left no trace. There were murmurs of a collapse, tunnels beneath the refinery rumored to have caved in, burying the men in darkness. A few, braver or perhaps more desperate, whispered something darker, that the men had been silenced, erased for reasons no one dared voice too loudly. The refinery's overseers offered little. A foreman, pale and tight-lipped, claimed the men had walked off, abandoning their posts in the night. It was a statement so absurd that even the most desperate among the crowd could not believe it. Where would 41 men go? Why would they leave their families, their wages, their very lives without a word? No, this was no desertion. This was something else. That night families gathered outside the factory gates, candles flickering against the darkness, their light reflected in the factory's cold, unblinking windows. Voices trembled as they called out names, prayers rising into the thick night air, but the only reply was silence. Silence so heavy it pressed against the chest, silence that seemed to seep from the very walls of the refinery itself. Inside, no one knew what had truly happened. Some workers, spared by fortune for not being on shift that night, spoke of strange sounds. Metallic groans, muffled cries, the sudden stillness that fell before midnight. They described the way the factory's machinery halted as if it too had been struck dumb. And yet, when the doors were finally pried open, there was nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle. The refinery was as it had always been. Except for its emptiness, the absence was unbearable. 41 voices silenced in a single night. 41 chairs left vacant at dinner tables. 41 pairs of boots left untouched by the door. The town could not comprehend it. Harrow had depended on the refinery, trusted it, even feared it, but never had it imagined the factory could consume so many lives in a single breath. Disbelief hung over every conversation, every street corner, every prayer whispered in the churches. People searched the riverbanks, combed the nearby woods, lit lanterns and carried them into the fields, but there was nothing. It was as if the men had been erased from the earth, and yet the refinery remained. Its chimneys stood tall, its bricks unbroken, its machines waiting for the next shift. To some, this was the most chilling detail of all. Progress did not stop. The factory seemed indifferent, as though the lives it had taken meant nothing. In the days that followed, disbelief gave way to something colder, suspicion. People began to ask the questions no one wanted to hear. Were the men trapped beneath its foundations, buried in its walls, or had the refinery hidden them away, their fate sealed by hands that valued profit over people? The town had no answers. Only the hollow echo of names called into the night, unanswered still. And so Harrow entered a new chapter, one not of sweetness or progress, but of silence. In the wake of the vanishing, Harrow did what any town would do. It turned to those in power for answers. Families knocked on doors, petitions were written, and delegations formed, each voice asking the same desperate question: where are the men? But the answers that came were not answers at all. Company executives emerged from their offices days later, their polished shoes and measured words offering little comfort. They claimed ignorance, insisting they had no record of anything unusual on the night of the disappearance. "The refinery is secure," one official stated coldly. "There is no evidence of foul play." To the grieving families, it was a slap in the face. How could 41 men simply vanish, and the company know nothing? Local officials were no better. The mayor offered condolences but urged the town not to let fear disrupt progress. Council members avoided the grieving widows on the street, turning their eyes away as if sorrow itself were contagious. In hushed meetings, they assured the executives that Harrow must move forward. After all, the refinery was not just an employer, it was the very lifeblood of the town's economy. To question it too deeply was to threaten Harrow's survival. For the families, the silence was unbearable. Mothers carried children to the company gates begging for answers. Wives demanded entry into the factory, insisting they would search themselves if no one else would. But every attempt was met with locked doors and guarded stairs. The refinery stood like a fortress, its walls thick, not only with brick, but with secrecy. Rumors began to swirl, and still the authorities dismissed them. When whispers of a collapse in the underground tunnels spread, officials called it baseless. When workers muttered of screams heard before midnight, they were warned to keep their mouths shut if they wanted to keep their job. And when townsfolk suggested that perhaps the men had been silenced deliberately, the accusation was met with scorn and threats. Newspapers printed only what they were told. Headlines spoke of labor unrest, hinting that the men had deserted Harrow, abandoning their families for some distant horizon. But anyone who knew them, anyone who had shared a meal or a prayer with them, understood the truth. These were men bound by duty, tethered to their homes. They would never walk away. The weight of grief settled heavily over the town. Candlelight vigils became nightly rituals, flames flickering against the darkness as names were read aloud, one by one, 41 names. 41 absences that could not be ignored. Children cried for fathers who would never return, their tears staining pillowcases as mothers held them close, unable to explain what could not be explained. Yet the world outside Harrow carried on. Trains came and went. Sugar shipments rolled out of the refinery as though nothing had changed. The company's profits grew, and officials congratulated themselves on their resilience. The missing men were reduced to shadows, their absence treated not as a wound, but as an inconvenience. And still the families waited. Some left plates set at dinner tables long after the food had grown cold. Some refused to wash the last shirts their husbands had worn, the fabric still carrying the faint scent of sugar and smoke. Others walked to the river each morning staring at the water as though it might carry their loved ones back to shore. Time dulled the outrage, but it never healed the pain. The authorities had spoken their final word: silence. Harrow was expected to move on, to bury its grief beneath layers of obedience and fear. But grief has a way of lingering. It seeps into walls, into streets, into the marrow of those left behind. And in Harrow it never left. The refinery still roared, its chimneys still climbed into the sky, but for the families of the 41, each puff of smoke was a cruel reminder of what had been lost, of what had been hidden, of what no one in power dared to admit. It was a silence that spoke louder than any truth. And in that silence, suspicion began to grow. Grief is heavy, but silence is heavier. When the days turned to weeks and the weeks stretched into months, the families of the vanished laborers refused to simply let time erase their loved ones. They searched not only for answers but for something to hold on to, a body, a clue, even a whisper of truth. Wives clutched worn photographs, their edges curled from constant touch, as if keeping the image alive would keep the man alive. Children tugged at their mothers' dresses, asking when their fathers would come home. Some were too young to even remember, their memories fading before they were fully formed, replaced only by stories whispered at bedtime. And the parents, the aging mothers and fathers, carried their grief like stones in their pockets, pulling them down with every step. The town saw a ritual unfold. Missing posters, pasted on lampposts and fences, yellowed in the sun and curled in the rain, but never taken down. They became part of the town's landscape, each face a silent accusation. Where are they? Vigils burned through the nights, candlelight flickering in rows along Harrow's narrow streets. Families gathered with bowed heads, murmuring prayers that sounded more like pleas than hopes. The smell of wax and smoke lingered in the air long after the candles were gone, clinging to walls and memory alike. Some families walked the riverbanks at dawn, searching the reeds and shallows, hoping the water had not kept its secrets. Others lingered outside the refinery gates, staring at the brick walls as if they could will them to speak. But the walls, like the officials and the company men, offered nothing but silence. It was said that at night, if you pressed your ear against the factory's iron doors, you could hear a low hum machinery, or something else entirely. For those left behind, that sound was not the rhythm of work, it was a heartbeat, a reminder that something was still alive in there, even if it wasn't human. Mothers passed their grief down to daughters, fathers to sons. What began as mourning turned into inheritance, a generational wound that refused to close. By the second year, people outside Harrow began to forget. Newspapers stopped printing updates. Outsiders turned away. But inside the town, the search never ended. Every shadow, every unexplained noise, every stray coat or boot found in the dirt sparked hope, then heartbreak. Stories began to spread. Some said they had seen figures at the edge of the fields at dusk. Men in soot-stained overalls, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. Others swore the voices of the missing could be heard when the wind pushed through the refinery's broken shutters. Most dismissed such talk as grief-stricken imagination. But in Harrow, people knew better. They knew when the earth held something back. Years passed, but the refinery's shadow only grew longer. Families carried on, but never let go. They lived with an empty chair at the table, with prayers that always ended unfinished. The children of the missing grew into adults marked by absence, their lives shaped by a story no one dared to close. And through it all, one thought remained, whispered from mother to child, from husbandless wife to her neighbors. The refinery swallowed them. Not the river, not the fields, not time or chance. The refinery itself. Its walls had become tombs without markers, its chimneys exhaled not only smoke but silence. And so Harrow carried on, a town built on sugar, grief, and ghosts. The refinery never slept. Its furnaces burned through the night, its gears groaned with endless hunger. Yet after the laborers vanished, the walls seemed to hum with more than machinery. They carried whispers. Some swore they heard of hidden tunnels beneath the refinery, carved hastily to move sugar out under the cover of night. Others spoke of shipments that never appeared on records, sacks marked not with sugar but with something heavier, something that rattled. And then there were the darker rumors that the 41 had not disappeared by accident at all, that they had raised their voices once too loudly against the endless hours, the meager pay, the broken bodies left behind by the machines. And in a town built on sugar, dissent was a poison. The company remained silent, its books sealed, its doors guarded. The officials repeated the same hollow refrain. There is nothing to be found. But the families knew better, the town knew better. In Harrow, the truth was a dangerous currency, and profit weighed heavier than flesh. And so the whispers grew louder, that the refinery had not just swallowed sugar, it had swallowed men. In the months that followed, something unsettling began to ripple through the refinery halls. What was once dismissed as grief-stricken imagination slowly became whispered legend. Workers spoke of shadows moving against the glow of the furnaces, figures half seen in the haze of sugar dust. Some swore they caught the sound of footsteps trailing them, though no one walked behind. At night, the clanging of the great iron rollers sometimes echoed like cries, long, hollow, mournful. The foremen barked at their men to keep working, but even they could not shake the feeling that the factory breathed differently now, as if it had swallowed something it could not digest. Men reported tools disappearing from their stations, only to be found later, placed neatly where no hand had left them. A few claimed that when the machinery groaned and seized, they saw pale hands in the gears, vanishing in an instant. Of course, the company denied such tales, superstition, they said. But within the laborers' quarters, where stories were traded like currency, the belief grew. The 41 had not simply vanished. They were still there, trapped inside the refinery's belly, restless and unseen. Soon, new hires refused to work the night shift. Old hands muttered prayers before stepping onto the factory floor. The refinery, once a symbol of wealth and progress, had become something else entirely. A place where the dead and the living worked side by side. The townsfolk began to avoid its looming silhouette after sundown. Its smokestacks no longer marked prosperity but sorrow, standing like black monuments to an unspoken truth. And beneath every rumor, one refrain endured. The refinery was haunted, not by ghosts in sheets, but by the weight of lives consumed and never returned. For years, the refinery stood as both monument and scar. The chimneys, now blackened with soot, became a backdrop to silence. But silence does not erase memory, nor does it keep the dead buried forever. It began quietly, whispers passed between the few old workers who remained. A page torn from a ledger, a note written in pencil on the back of a sugar shipment invoice. Pieces of a story scattered and hidden, yet pulsing with urgency. And when the families gathered in the church basement, clutching lanterns against the damp Virginia night, they laid those fragments on the table like offerings. The first was a journal, worn, water-damaged, the spine broken in places. It belonged to a man named Elias Turner, a laborer who vanished with the others. His words, scrawled in tired script, painted a picture not of simple labor but of fear. We are kept past sundown. The tunnels are not sound. No air in the lower shafts. Some men cough until they bleed. I hear talk they mean to seal parts of it. But with us inside? Lord help us if that is true. The room went cold when those lines were read aloud. It was no longer speculation, it was testimony. Elias's words carried the weight of a man who had known something was coming, who had seen the shadow before it fell. Then came the payroll sheets. Meticulous, drawn in ink, they recorded every man who worked those sugar tunnels, until they didn't. 41 names, cut off mid-page, as though they had ceased to exist overnight. No dismissal recorded, no final payment, just blank space. The company ledger moved on as though they had never been. And yet, families remembered. They knew the hands that tilled the soil, the faces that sat at dinner tables, the voices that hummed hymns in the evenings. To erase them on paper was to kill them twice. But it was the construction records that unsettled most. Folded maps of the refinery grounds showed an addition, an expansion of storage silos and tunnels that had never been mentioned publicly. Red ink marked the foundation lines. One note, scribbled in the corner, read, sealed, August 1852. No entry permitted. The date was precise. The month the men disappeared. The pieces formed a shape too dark to ignore. This was not vanishing. This was burial. The families looked at one another, stricken, as if breathing the same grim realization that the refinery had swallowed their husbands, their fathers, their sons, and the earth had been poured back over them, layer by layer, until only sugar and silence remained. Rumors spread quickly. Perhaps the tunnels had collapsed, trapping the laborers alive, their cries muffled by soil and steel until no one heard them anymore. Perhaps they had been silenced deliberately, their bodies hidden in the dark so that no word of unsafe conditions or unfair wages would escape. Perhaps profit demanded their disappearance. No one knew for certain. But the evidence, the journals, the payrolls, the sealed construction plans told a story far different from the one officials had offered. This was not absence, this was concealment. One widow, her hands trembling as she clutched her husband's name in the missing payroll, whispered words that hung in the heavy air. They didn't vanish. They were buried alive in sugar. The image stuck. A sweetness masking horror, a refinery feeding on men as though they were part of the machinery. It was then the weight of grief shifted into something else. Something harder, sharper. Not only sorrow, but rage. Rage that those men had been taken, erased, hidden beneath profit and lies. Rage that their story had been reduced to silence. But even rage could not break down the walls of the refinery. The company stood firm, its gates locked, its executives untouchable. The families were left to circle the grounds, carrying lanterns, searching the soil with their eyes as though memory itself might call the buried up from beneath. And still the records remained. The only testimony left behind. Silent papers that whispered louder than officials ever would. As the town passed into another year, the refinery loomed, its bricks heavy with secrets. People began to speak less of the men as missing and more as hidden. Their story was not one of absence but of burial. The difference mattered, for in that difference lay a promise that one day, what was hidden would be unearthed. And with each discovery, each whispered rumor, each torn scrap of evidence, the community edged closer to a truth too long sealed beneath the weight of sugar and stone. The vanishing was no mystery. It was a cover, and covers like tunnels cannot hold forever. Time, they say, has a way of burying all things, truth, grief, and sometimes even bodies. For decades, the Sinclair refinery stood in silence, its brick walls weathered, its machines rusted, its fields grown wild. Generations passed, but the shadow of 1852 lingered. Families whispered their stories, old men warned their grandchildren not to walk too close to the grounds, and the missing 62 remained a wound in Virginia's soil. Then, years later, when redevelopment swept through the region, the earth began to give up its secrets. Crews arrived with bulldozers and drills, intent on carving the past into something profitable. Another warehouse, another complex. But the ground resisted. Holes collapsed in on themselves, strange voids opened beneath the weight of machines, and workers spoke of finding objects that had no place in ordinary soil. A rumor spread first, faint and uncertain. Someone had unearthed tools, rusted shovels, broken picks, their handles splintered as if abandoned mid-strike. Another whispered of fragments of clothing, faded but unmistakably human in shape, buried deep where no farmer's plow could ever reach. And then, the most unsettling of all, bones. Not fossils, not animal remains, but something that carried the unmistakable shape of a hand, a jaw, a rib. The story spread like wildfire. No report was ever filed. No photographs made the papers. Officially, nothing had been found. Yet the workers who dug there told a different tale. Some swore they saw a sealed chamber, a brick vault beneath the refinery floor, its entrance hastily bricked shut. Others whispered that it was quickly covered again, filled in before curious eyes could pry too deep. Those who spoke too openly were silenced with warnings, or simply stopped showing up at the site. The families listened with hearts that trembled between hope and horror. For decades they had carried the absence, the not knowing. And now perhaps the truth was clawing its way back into daylight. Could it be that their fathers, their husbands, their brothers had never truly left the refinery grounds at all? Could it be that the refinery had not simply swallowed them in metaphor, but in reality entombed them where profit demanded silence? The whispers grew darker still. That the sealed chamber had been deliberately constructed, its walls reinforced, not for stability but for secrecy. That payroll ledgers' missing names matched the numbers of those never seen again. That Sinclair himself had ordered silence, his fortune built on the backs and perhaps the graves of those laborers. But without proof, the story remained trapped between history and folklore, too fragile to withstand scrutiny, too haunting to be dismissed. Officials dismissed the rumors as superstition, the artifacts as coincidence. Yet in taverns, in churchyards, in quiet kitchens late at night, the people told each other what they believed. The ground itself remembered, and it was finally trying to speak. And so the refinery's silence cracked, not with thunder, but with a whisper from beneath the soil, a whisper that hinted at chambers sealed in darkness, at tools abandoned mid-labor, at bones that might have belonged to the 62. A whisper that the truth was not lost, only buried. In the decades that followed, the Harrow Refinery stood less as a monument of industry and more as a shadow cast over the lives of everyone who had once depended on it. The name Harrow, once advertised in bright lettering on sacks of sugar shipped across the country, became a word spoken in hushed tones. To outsiders, it was just another closed-down factory, one more relic of a fading era of American industry. But for those who lived in its shadow, it meant something darker, something unspoken. The families of the missing carried their grief like a second skin. Children grew up without fathers, wives endured lives defined by unanswered questions. And elderly parents went to their graves never knowing the truth. In kitchen drawers and attic boxes, yellowed posters with the faces of the lost remained too painful to throw away, yet too heavy to display. Every year on the anniversary of the disappearances, small vigils were still held, candles flickering against the refinery's rusted silhouette, a reminder that silence had never truly settled. Locals began to treat the grounds like cursed earth. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the ruins, but few lasted long inside. They spoke of a suffocating heaviness, as though the air itself resisted them. Residents of the nearby town avoided the refinery road altogether, preferring longer routes just to keep the looming structure out of sight. It wasn't just about fear of danger, it was a quiet acknowledgement that something was deeply wrong there, something unresolved. For the community, the Harrow Refinery became a lesson carved into memory. What happens when power goes unchecked, when human lives are measured only against profit margins? The whispers of cover-ups, the inconsistencies in the records, the rumors of buried truths, all of it became part of a larger story, one that haunted not just the descendants of the lost, but the conscience of the town itself. The trauma did not remain confined to those who had lived through it. It echoed down generations, shaping the way families spoke or didn't speak about their past. A granddaughter might hear only fragments of the story from an aging grandmother, delivered in broken sentences and heavy silences. A grandson might grow up warned never to take certain jobs, never to trust certain promises made by men in suits. In this way, the refinery's shadow stretched far beyond the rusting gates, embedding itself into the cultural DNA of the community. Even as time moved forward, as new industries rose and old ones crumbled, the Harrow Refinery was remembered less for the sugar it once produced, and more for the silence it demanded. It became a symbol, a kind of dark shorthand for corruption, neglect, and the human cost of greed. To speak of Harrow was not to talk about business or commerce, but about loss, secrecy, and the devastating power of unanswered questions. And so the legacy endured, not in ledgers or monuments, but in the scars left on families and the cautionary tale that locals passed on. The Harrow Refinery was no longer an industrial giant, but a warning etched into memory that silence can be more powerful than truth, and that sometimes what we choose not to uncover can haunt us more than what we face. The refinery may have stopped its machines long ago, but in its quiet, the echoes still lived on. Time has a way of covering over even the darkest scars. Grass grows, structures collapse, memory bends, but some absences never truly fade. The story of the Harrow Refinery is not one that ends neatly, tied with certainty. Instead, it remains suspended, a wound that refuses to heal, a whisper that clings to the air long after the last chimney fell silent. The records of the missing 41 men are still incomplete. No graves marked their passage, no memorial etched their names. Their families were left with questions instead of answers, silence instead of closure. The refinery went on producing sugar, sweetening tables across the nation, while beneath its foundations something bitter was left unresolved. Were those men victims of a tragic collapse, their bodies swallowed by stone and machinery? Or were they silenced deliberately, hidden under the very earth they labored upon? The evidence remains fragmentary. Payrolls cut short, journals abandoned mid-sentence, construction records that contradict themselves. Each fragment hints at a story that refuses to be fully told. For the town of Harrow, the refinery became more than a building. It became a specter, a reminder of what happens when power towers over the powerless. Families who trace their lineage back to those workers still speak in hushed tones, unwilling or unable to name what they believe happened. Perhaps the truth lies buried still beneath the weeds and rust. Or perhaps it was never written down at all, carried only in the memories of those who dared not speak. And so the Harrow Refinery remains a place where history and legend blur. A place where fact and folklore walk side by side. Where every missing piece feels like a deliberate silence. The question that lingers is the one no one has ever answered. Was it an accident, a crime, or a secret too dangerous to tell? Until the ground gives up its truths, the story of the missing men will remain unfinished. Not forgotten, not resolved, just unfinished. Fade to black.